Hotep, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to another edition of Perspectives in Religion. My name is Wayne Purcell, and as always, we'll be telling our story. And this being the beginning of Black History Month, I'd like to share with you some of the struggles and the trials that our people went through. Great men and women such as Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Mary McLeod Bethune, Frederick Douglass, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, David Walker. In fact, I have some excerpts I want to read to you from David Walker. We're going to talk about John Brown Harper's Ferry, the African Methodist Episcopal Church and its struggles to emancipate our people, the legal laws of racism and Jim Crow. Then we also want to talk about the uprisings of our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean and South America, and St. Dominique to be one in particular, as well as Jamaica, and how they inspired the African American over here in America. But nevertheless, as I stated, David Walker, who wrote an appeal somewhere back in the early 1800s, wrote perhaps what was considered the most dangerous publication that a black man ever wrote during this time. It became known as David Walker's Appeal, and it was an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States. And his appeal was about to enlighten African Americans to break the chains of slavery and bondage and to rise up their spirit that was within them to overcome their degraded position in life. And in his book, David Walker's Appeal, he smuggled it into the hands of his audience, which for the most part were Southern blacks. And as I said, he admonished them to rise up and overthrow their masters. This was frightening to the white man and to white Americans because, as far as they were concerned, African Americans were docile people and people who were they seasoned them to fear and respect them, and to have stuff like this to be written was incomprehensible. So naturally, David Walker was a marked man, and if any slave was caught reading this book, she could be maimed and even killed as an example to others who might try to enlighten themselves. But one of the, just to give you an example, it says that legislators in Georgia and Louisiana became so alarmed that they enacted harsh new laws restricting black literacy. In fact, this has always been part of the plan of Southern whites to keep the African slave ignorant. And so they had laws that restricted black literacy, including a ban on the distribution of anti-slavery literature, which this was. That is David Walker's Appeal. And then similar legislation narrowly passed the Virginia House of Delegates, but they say that expired later. But North Carolina enacted its own versions of the restrictions in the autumn of 1830, and horrified and petrified, mortified journalists joined in from the North in denouncing what a Boston editor called one of the most wicked and inflammatory productions ever issued from the press. I mean, isn't that something that they could say stuff like this when the press then would write about blacks being sold for slavery, would take pictures of black men and women hanging, would make postcards of it and send them out, and had all of these buffoon pictures that they would print and send out, yet they have the nerve now to attack the publication of a black man who is trying to overcome the degradations of slavery and oppression for his people, or against his people, I should say. And because of his anti-slavery literature, they demonized him. But not even that, though. William Lloyd Garrison, who was an anti-slavery spokesman, expressed his concern that the book itself was wrote with such hatred of slavery that he denounced it. But they found that the pamphlet itself now certainly was within the spirit of freedom. But more than a century and a half later, David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world is still a startling document to be remembered. It says, "It certainly ranks among the angriest and most controversial American anti-slavery tracts addressed to Walker's fellow blacks. It is a powerful reminder that slaves and so-called free persons of color were important participants in the great struggle over slavery that led to the Civil War. Walker's withering attacks on racial injustice and his pleas for black unity anticipate lines of African American protests that have endured among integrationists and black nationalists alike. Yet in many respects, the appeal is also a perplexing work, shrouded in mysteries that may never be fully solved. Who was David Walker? What shaped his thinking? Apart from his sorrow and anger at the travails of his people, what did he think he would accomplish with this writing? And how did events reach a point where, for a brief but terrifying moment, his appeal was the most notorious publication in America?" The known facts of Walker's early biography are sparse but suggestive. We know that he was born in or near Wilmington, North Carolina, the son of a slave father and a free black mother. Thus, under the laws of slavery, he was born free. The year of his birth is uncertain, although most convincing recent research contends that it was about 1796 or 1797, which says that, incidentally, that during this time that records were not really kept on the African American. But nevertheless, by his own account in the appeal, Walker left Wilmington as a literate young man and wandered around the United States, residing for an unspecified period in Charleston. Charleston, remind you, is also where Denmark Vesey put together one of the greatest plots to an assertion that has ever been known. And chances are that he and David Walker crossed paths because both of them were participants in the AME Church. And so in 1825, he turned up as a used clothes dealer in Boston, where he would spend the rest of his abbreviated life. Walker's decision to leave his hometown was not surprising, although Wilmington was emerging as a North Carolina's leading port, and although blacks greatly outnumbered whites, only a tiny number of the city's blacks were free. Slaves performed most of the city's skilled and unskilled work, leaving someone like Walker with meager economic prospects. Looking back on his life years later, Walker said nothing about Wilmington. Still, Walker's boyhood almost certainly contributed to his later preoccupations with religion and rebellion. At the beginning of the 19th century, the vast majority of Wilmington blacks, along with a handful of whites, attended Sunday services at two local Methodist meeting houses, overseen by several African American elders and stewards. Although it is impossible to ascertain whether Walker was raised as a church member, it is hard to believe that he grew up completely unaware of the Methodist teachings. Young Walker may also have learned about the history of slave unrest and white fears of unrest in the Wilmington area, which dated back to the years of the American Revolution. In 1775, amid rumors of an impending emancipation by British authorities, a slave conspiracy centered in Wilmington was detected at the last minute and suppressed. In 1781, when British forces under the command of Lord Cornwallis advanced toward the city, slaves flocked to the British lines in the hopes of gaining their freedom. They then assisted in the plunder of nearby farms and plantations, and stood by when the Redcoats finally captured Wilmington and sacked it. 10 years later, news of the slave rebellion in Saint Dominique stirred slaveholders' fears that their own slaves were plotting some sort of uprising. Those fears materialized in Wilmington over the summer of 1795, when a band of runaway slaves under the command of a self-styled General of the Swamps terrorized local whites with sporadic violence. The attacks continued until local posses hunted down the rebels and killed them all, including the general. Events in Charleston around the time that Walker lived there may have also sharpened his thinking about slavery, rebellion, and Christian righteousness. Over the decade before 1820, the period when Walker most likely left home, Charleston was something of a mecca for ambitious Southern free blacks. Unlike Wilmington, Charleston had a large free black adult population, which was employed in a wide range of skilled crafts, as well as in petty retailing and day laborer jobs. Many of the city slaves, meanwhile, led relatively unrelegated lives, hired out to work for local whites. Charleston's free blacks and slaves commingled in numerous formal and informal associations, including after 1817, a formidable African Methodist Episcopal Church organized in several congregations. As these black associations expanded, they struck some Charleston slaveholders as a potential threat to public order. These fears in turn led racial tensions to escalate. The tensions exploded in July 1822 when authorities uncovered the insurrectionary schemes of the ex-slave Charleston carpenter and Methodist church leader Denmark Vesey. This is why I say that Denmark Vesey and David Walker, two men who had to think alike, certainly had to have crossed paths and shared their anger and concern about their people and slavery. And not only that, but to also find themselves as preachers of God's Word and teachers of God's Word and believers in God. They also saw the Bible not unlike whites, whereby they saw the Bible talk for liberation and emancipation of people and freedom, and that God is no respecter of persons. So where the whites could stand up and say, slaves, love your masters, and that the same Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, could look at that same Bible and see where God says that when the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. And here we have now a classic example of Denmark Vesey, who was a Methodist church leader, rising up from the Bible, using the Bible as the impetus of moving forward with an insurrection against the white slave owners of Charleston. But along with the Richmond slave Gabriel Prosser, he started a rebellion, or planned a rebellion in 1800. But it failed because he was sold out naturally by his own. And then there was Nat Turner, let's not forget him, of Southampton, Virginia, whose uprising, I believe it was in 1831, along with 70 of his band of guys, got together and terrorized, killed whites, farmers, their men, women, and children, and didn't spare anyone, and struck such fear into the Southern whites that new laws was established to prevent again, literacy and congregation of slaves and congregation of free blacks and slaves. All sorts of conniving ways and schemes were devised that would and could keep the slave under control. But Vesey's plot, Denmark Vesey's plot, is remembered as one of the boldest slave conspiracies of the pre-Civil War, and its origins lay mainly among Charleston's African Methodists. Again, the AME Church. The very existence of autonomous AME congregations unsettled the white people of Charleston, and who, with reason, became worried that black believers would seize upon troublesome scriptural texts about bondage and freedom and turn them into anti-slavery exhortations. That's the ignorance of the people here during this time. The white people of Charleston was so ignorant to think that the Bible couldn't possibly speak of freedom and bondage, but that it talked about simply slaves loving your masters and them as white people being dominant and superior and chosen over the African to be his caretaker. And this is what they saw in the Bible when they read it. Two opposing views, nevertheless. But here we have the Methodist meetings, which as they continued to meet time after time, they were warned by the local authorities, and they even tried to suppress the Methodist meetings. But any Christian group, as you know, or any group that has faith, will only harden their resolve to continue in what they were doing. And this is what happened. So they continued to resist. And the AME church classes continued to meet semi-clandestinely around the city and in total secrecy from white Charlestonians. The redoubled Vesey began recruiting a tightly knit group of prominent church members, along with a African-born conjurer named Jack Purcell. That's right, isn't that something? Jack Purcell, who they called Gula Jack, in an ambitious secret plan to raise a black army, seize the city arsenal, and lay Charleston to waste, after which the rebels would escape to freedom and leave emboldened plantation hands to rise up and destroy South Carolina slavery forever. Isn't that interesting? It was later reported that 9,000 slaves and free blacks from Charleston and nearby plantations joined the conspiracy, a number that was probably exaggerated, they say. But no matter how large the army actually was, Vesey and his lieutenants certainly made ample and effective use of biblical prophecies to inspire the troops, sometimes calling together Methodist class meetings as covers for their planning sessions. Moreover, Vesey's care in building a highly centralized underground organization successfully kept the plot under wraps until the eve of the planned uprising. White officials learned of Vesey's plans only by chance. Thereafter, in an atmosphere that sometimes verged on hysteria, they arrested and tried 79 alleged conspirators, convicted 59 of them, hanged 34, including Vesey, and condemned 35 to exile, including some of those who had not been acquitted. Now, that doesn't include the many blacks that were simply slaughtered by virtue of the fact that all it takes is white fears to say one word, and they would then gather together as a group and as a band of hooligans and just go about killing anybody who was of color. They don't talk, well, in some literatures that you may come across, they do talk about it, but in this, it doesn't, because it's just given somewhat of an introduction, because this is David Walker's appeal, and what they're doing is laying the foundation for what you and I will be studying for the next couple of weeks. But another interesting thing about is that when they went to trial, Denmark Vesey, Gulajak, and some of his other lieutenants made a vow to keep their mouths shut and not to say anything during their trial, which they did not. But Vesey defended himself. He was his own lawyer, didn't want legal advice, defended himself. And there's not much in the records to talk about how he defended himself and what he did, etc. Because again, they didn't keep and didn't believe in keeping good records of, or any records really, of African Americans. But we do know that the judge said that Vesey handled himself with remarkable skill and intellect, and that he had a charisma about him that was unshakable. End of quote. However, none of the surviving sources on the Vesey affair mention anyone named David Walker. Now, David Walker is the one that, in his appeal, talks about this very same things that Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosper, and all the others during their uprising certainly was around the same time as this literature that we're talking about today was written. But again, nobody never mentioned the name David Walker. Neither do David Walker's writings mention Vesey. So so they didn't mention either one. Of course they wouldn't. Why would they? I mean, these were two great men who knew what they were doing would only lead to death. So why would they say anything outside of, or to you or I, or at least why publish it in the book? So just like David Walker didn't mention anything in the book, Denmark Vesey didn't mention anything about his meetings with David Walker, nor the church. But that's the ignorance of people if they think that these men would share with them what they talked about. That would be like Malcolm and Martin talking in private and then coming back and sharing their information to those who were inflicting and desecrating our civil rights. So there are passing references in the appeal to Walker's Charleston's Day, including a description of a church camp meeting. The incidentals of those passages seem to date from 1821. The possibility that Walker was in the city a year later, and that even more fascinating possibility that he was one of Vesey's unnamed foot soldiers, will forever be matters of conjecture. It is reasonable, however, to suppose that at some point during this time in the small city he met people who were connected with the Charleston AME Church and who either knew or had known Vesey and his Confederates. In view of the heavy publicity given the affair, including 2 book-length published reports on the conspiracy and trials, it is likely that the literate Walker learned something of Vesey's revolutionary blueprints. What is certain is that 7 years later, Walker was mulling over an even more elaborate plan to arouse the slaves of the South with biblical prophecies of deliverance. And Walker, that is David Walker's his appeal. But in the South, certainly there were men such as we mentioned before, Gabriel Prosper, and we know that Nat Turner, certainly not too far from here in Virginia, had to have heard of Vesey's plot. I'm sure they got word from Santo Domingo, from Haiti, St. Louis, Toussaint Overture, because we do know that in South America and those places in the Caribbeans that their uprisings certainly surpassed the uprisings that went on here in America. They literally took over in the Caribbeans, and but the difference there, however, is that the blacks were always a majority on the Caribbean islands, and so for the African to have uprisings in those Caribbean islands where they were the majority, their chances of succeeding was a lot better than here in America, where for the most part we have always been a minority, even though places like Charleston boasted a population of blacks that certainly did outnumber whites. But remember, whites still had the federal government, the militia, the Army, Navy to call at their call. So whenever there was something of an uprising that was noted, if they couldn't handle it, they could just simply make a phone call, and everything would order would be restored. And so we have here during a time of slavery where men and women certainly rebelled against slavery, did what they could to undermine slavery, but the disadvantage that the slave found himself being in a land that was not ours, being in a environment that they knew nothing of, being chained and shackled, knowing that whatever direction they ran in, they could be pursued and caught by any white person. So it made it very difficult for black people to fight for their freedom. But yet they did. They did everything they could. Certainly, let us not be fooled by the pictures and the stories and the half-truths about that slaves were happy, that they were happy slaves, and that no man or woman is happy when she is owned by someone else. Just like a child. I mean, when you grow up as a child, and when you get to a certain age in childhood, all of a sudden you start rebelling because you no longer like the authority that mom and dad have over you. You know, you want to go and come when you feel like it. You can't wait to get out of high school. You can't wait to get of age. You can't wait to get out of your house. I mean, it's a natural instinct to want to be free and to be free. And so to say that a slave was happy in his condition is ludicrous. You know, that's easy for maybe you to say, but no man or no woman would want to spend the rest of their lives being a servant to a master who is flesh and blood like you and me, who would know, but the only difference being the color of their skin. And how does your skin color make you a better person than someone else? You know, that's the mindset, you see. And then you were dealing with a sadist society. Southern whites were sadistic. I mean, they loved, it amused them to hang blacks, to kill blacks, to maim black people. It amused them to go out on hanging parties. It amused them to drink and get drunk and to say that they heard a black man try to rape a white woman. It amused them to go out and not to just look for one, but to look for anybody who happened to be out. Didn't matter. It amused them to be able to go into a town where prominent black men and women lived who lived better than them. It amused them that they had the authority and the power to go in and destroy a neighborhood, a community, and not have anything to fear. You know, that was a sadistic mind that prevailed throughout the South. That African Americans, had to live under this type of system. Yet they did. They did, and they managed to create a community within a community and make the best out of a hostile situation. Flash forward, 300 years later, and here we are, and we can't seem to get it together. I mean, I saw in the papers the other day where we still don't even make the wages that white people make. They still got a lock on it, and they don't. It doesn't bother them the fact that they make more than us, because they feel that that's their right. They feel that that's their privilege, and that we should be thankful. Well, this is Black History Month, and we're going to be talking about a lot of those things. My time is up, but we're going to share those things with you. We're going to share about some of the great leaders who, in spite of the many obstacles and the trials and all that stood before them, yet they still were determined to rise up and take their liberation. You've been listening to Perspectives in Religion. My name is Wayne Purcell, and as always, I thank you for allowing me to share our story. Hotep.